August 16, 1943. Over the grey expanse of Regensburg, Bavaria, the sky itself seemed to shatter. It was just after dawn when the first shadows appeared on the horizon. German spotters rubbed their eyes in disbelief, mistaking the silhouettes for some kind of illusion born from the haze of morning. But the hum grew louder, an oceanic roar of engines deeper and heavier than anything they had ever heard. Then the glint of sunlight struck metal wings, row after row after row. The Luftwaffe ground controllers froze as the endless tide swept overhead. It was not a raid, it was an armada. 4-engine bombers, their wings stretched across the heavens, seemed to multiply as far as the horizon could hold. The number was unthinkable. By the time the first formations passed overhead, another wave was already behind them, and behind that another. Panic crackled across German radio frequencies. Unmöglich, so viele Flugzeuge. Bundesarchiv, Luftwaffe Radio Intercept, Augen 1943. Anti-aircraft crews rushed to their stations, their hands trembling. The shriek of sirens filled the air, echoing through the cobblestone streets and across the Danube River. Mothers clutched children as factories emptied, workers running for the shelters. But even beneath the earth they could feel the vibration, like the approach of an earthquake powered not by nature, but by steel and gasoline. Flak gunners turned their barrels skyward, but the sky itself seemed consumed by this moving wall of metal. One officer whispered, as if speaking the truth would make it vanish, "Es gibt nicht so viele Flugzeuge in der ganzen Welt." There are not this many planes in the entire world. Yet they were here, engines droning like thunder without end. Above, the formations moved with mechanical precision. B-17 flying fortresses, their noses painted with teeth, pin-up girls and bombs, each machine carrying its deadly load toward the Reich. Between their wings, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings swirled, bracing for the inevitable clash. The German defenders scrambled Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s into the air, but the sheer volume of targets overwhelmed their tactics. For every bomber downed, 5 more pressed forward. The Luftwaffe aces, men with dozens of kills to their names, pulled their throttles back in disbelief. They were not fighting airplanes anymore. They were fighting a factory line that never seemed to end. U.S. Army Air Forces After Action Report 1943. The smell of cordite and burning oil filled the sky. Explosions bloomed like black flowers among the formations, but the waves did not falter. Crews inside the bombers braced as flak tore through aluminum skins, but replacements filled the gaps instantly, the endless formation reshaping itself like water closing around a stone. In the Luftwaffe command posts, frustration boiled into dread. Reports screamed across the wire. 100 bombers inbound Regensburg. Correction 200. Correction 500. The numbers were being revised faster than anyone could write them. By the end of the first hour, commanders no longer trusted the reports at all. And then came the realization, the nightmare truth. This was not the limit of American strength. This was just a single strike, on a single day over a single city. By July, intelligence had confirmed something the German High Command refused to believe. Across the Atlantic, the United States had harnessed its industrial might into something beyond comprehension. Factories in Detroit, Seattle, Wichita, and Long Beach were not producing planes by the dozens or hundreds. They were producing them by the thousands. 8,000 aircraft every month rolling off assembly lines like automobiles, each one crewed, tested, and shipped into war. U.S. War Production Board, Monthly Report 1943. The men on the ground felt it first as disbelief. How could any nation summon such abundance? Soldiers who had once laughed at America as a land of jazz clubs and chewing gum now stared at the sky with a mixture of awe and terror. The German fighter pilots knew the truth best. They could win duels in the air, down dozens, even hundreds, but it no longer mattered. The Americans had turned warfare into mathematics. For every pilot lost, another was trained. For every bomber destroyed, another 3 took its place. Even the most ruthless Luftwaffe ace found himself staring into the abyss of arithmetic, where courage and skill meant little against endless replacement. Panic seeped into the diaries of German officers. If they can lose 1,000 aircraft in a month and replace them within weeks, one Luftwaffe colonel wrote, then what chance do we have? Bundesarchiv Luftwaffe Officer Diary, September 1941. The tone of the entries shifted from confidence to resignation. The war was no longer about strategy alone. It was about production, and the United States had unleashed a torrent that no blockade, no bomb, no counterstroke could stop. In the ruined streets of Regensburg, children watched the bombers pass like migrating birds that never ended. The city shook, windows shattered, steel mills went silent. But the true shock was not in the destruction. It was in the realization that this wave was just one of many. Tomorrow another city, next week another 1,000 planes. And behind each raid, the unthinkable promise that more were already being built, even as the bombs were still falling. The Reich's propaganda tried to explain it away. They told their people that the Americans were reckless, that their machines were weak, that quality would defeat quantity. But the truth spread faster than the leaflets. German civilians whispered about the endless bombers that kept coming, no matter how many fell. The Wehrmacht soldiers on the front wrote home in disbelief, describing skies so full of planes that daylight itself seemed to dim. And among the Luftwaffe, where pride had once been carved into the Iron Cross, a seed of despair began to grow. What they could not know, not yet, was the full scale of what they faced. This was not just production. It was mobilization on a scale the world had never seen. It was Henry Ford's assembly line applied to warfare, Rosie the riveter's hands shaping the wings of death, engineers and machinists working around the clock under floodlights in plants that stretched for miles. While German factories huddled under camouflage netting, American plants roared in open daylight, defiant, unstoppable, as the formations over Regensburg turned back toward the west, leaving smoke and fire in their wake. One truth hung over Germany like the pall of their own burning cities. This was no ordinary war. This was industry transformed into a weapon. The Luftwaffe had asked how many planes America could build. The answer had just thundered across their skies. More than you can ever shoot down, and this was only the beginning. The real secret. The machinery. The manpower. The raw fury of industrial genius remained hidden thousands of miles away, deep inside the American heartland. Soon the enemy would learn the impossible numbers. Soon they would discover that 8,000 planes a month was not a boast. It was a reality. And that reality would change the war forever. Cliffhanger silence. Then the whisper of an unanswered question. If the United States could summon this storm of steel, what else was waiting across the Atlantic? By early 1943, the world had become a furnace. The Second World War stretched across continents, swallowing nations and bleeding armies into the soil. In Europe, the Axis still held vast territories. France remained under the swastika. The Eastern Front raged with unimaginable ferocity, and Britain clung to survival beneath nightly bombing raids. Yet the tide was shifting subtly but unmistakably, and at the center of this shift stood a question of production. For Germany, a nation whose doctrine revolved around speed, precision, and tactical brilliance, the battlefield was as much the factory floor as the front line. For America, half a world away, the war was becoming less about strategy and more about raw, unstoppable scale. At the start of the conflict, even Hitler and Goering had dismissed the United States as militarily soft. They imagined a country of isolationist politicians, industrialists consumed with cars and radios, and a public unwilling to sacrifice creature comforts for war. The Americans can build refrigerators and washing machines, one Nazi propaganda sheet sneered in 1941. But war demands steel, blood and will. Bundesarchiv, Propaganda-Abteilung Report, 1940. Yet by 1943, the truth was evident. The very machinery that had once produced refrigerators was now producing bombers, fighters, tanks, and ships in numbers the Reich could not match. The global balance in air power revealed the scale most clearly. At the beginning of the war, the Luftwaffe boasted roughly 4,000 operational aircraft, sleek machines flown by hardened veterans from Spain, Poland, and France. Their doctrine emphasized concentrated strikes, rapid breakthroughs, and flexible command. They believed quality, training, and innovation would always outweigh mass. For a time, it seemed true. In Poland, in France, in the opening blows against the Soviet Union, German air power shattered resistance with terrifying efficiency. But against Britain, and later against the United States, the mathematics began to turn. By 1943, Germany struggled to replace even a fraction of its monthly losses. managing only about 1,200 new aircraft per month at best. Meanwhile, American records show that U.S. industry was producing 10 times that amount. U.S. War Production Board Statistical Review, 1943. The disparity widened not only in numbers but in doctrine. German commanders clung to the idea of elite formations and specialized weapons. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 remained their workhorse fighter, sleek and deadly, but increasingly outdated. The Focke-Wulf 190 was powerful but scarce. Jet projects like the Me-262 remained locked in bureaucratic delays. In contrast, American doctrine emphasized relentless replacement. It did not matter if an individual pilot lacked the finesse of a German ace. What mattered was that he flew in formation, in a machine backed by a system that ensured another aircraft was always waiting in reserve. Numbers tell the story. Between January and June 1943, the Luftwaffe lost over 8,000 aircraft across all fronts. OKL Loss Records, 1943. Many of these were irreplaceable veterans, their experience wiped out with each crash into the Russian steppe or English Channel. In the same span, American factories had rolled out over 40,000 new planes. This was not just a war of attrition, it was a war of replacement speed. A Luftwaffe squadron might celebrate downing a dozen flying fortresses one week, only to find the next raid was even larger than the last. Commanders on both sides recognized the stakes. For the Allies, General Henry H. Hap Arnold, chief of the U.S. Army Air Forces, insisted that control of the skies could only be won through overwhelming force. Air superiority is not a matter of chance, he declared in a 1943 address. It is a matter of numbers, fuel, and production lines. U.S. Army Air Forces speech, 1943. For the Germans, General Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most respected aces, warned Berlin that the American tide could not be ignored. They replace aircraft faster than we can shoot them down, he told colleagues, frustration bleeding into fatalism. Bundesarchiv Galland memoir notes, the broader context of the war only magnified the imbalance. In North Africa, the Afrika Korps was collapsing under pressure from Allied logistics that never seemed to run dry. In the Pacific, American carriers unleashed squadrons of aircraft at Midway and Guadalcanal that were already being replaced before the battles even ended. And in Europe, the daylight bombing campaign had begun, sending hundreds of B-17s and B-24s deep into the Reich. For German civilians, this was no longer an abstract statistic. It was a daily reminder as air raid sirens wailed and skies darkened under bomber streams. Archival reports from Nara note that Luftwaffe doctrine assumed bomber raids would come in small, manageable waves, 50 planes here, perhaps 100 at most. Their flak defenses, radar coverage, and fighter interception tactics were designed around those expectations. But when formations of 300, 500, or even 1,000 bombers arrived, the system broke under the sheer weight of reality. Nara Luftwaffe Defense Analysis, 1943. Anti-aircraft guns ran out of ammunition. Fighter wings were exhausted after only a few sorties, and commanders were forced to abandon coherent strategy in favor of desperate improvisation. The psychological toll was immense. For civilians in Hamburg, Kassel, or Bremen, the sight of bombers overhead no longer inspired the grim confidence that the Reich could repel them. Instead, it sparked whispered questions. If this is one raid, how many more will come? Diaries recovered from German households after the war speak of disbelief at the scale. One Hamburg resident wrote, "The sky was never empty. It was like a river of machines flowing endlessly from west to east." Bundesarchiv Civilian Diary Collection. For the Allies, the numbers were a weapon in themselves. Every successful raid reinforced the belief that victory was inevitable, not because of battlefield brilliance but because of industrial inevitability. American commanders calculated the war not in battles, but in tonnage of bombs dropped, miles of production line conveyor belts, and the capacity of shipping convoys across the Atlantic. They trusted in the machine, in the system, in the ability of a continent's resources to grind down the enemy. Yet within this broader context lay the seed of a secret the Germans could not comprehend. They saw the bombers, they counted the formations, but they did not yet grasp how it was possible. How could one nation build 8,000 planes a month? How could America sustain such a torrent without collapsing under its own weight? The answer was hidden in the factories, the assembly lines, the engineers, and the workers who transformed Detroit, Seattle, and California into the beating heart of the arsenal of democracy. But that revelation, the hidden advantage, was still to come. For now, in the summer of 1943, all the Germans knew was what they could see with their own eyes. The skies above their cities filled with an impossible number of aircraft and no end in sight. The Reich had once mocked American industry. Now it was staring into a storm it could neither match nor stop, and still the question remained unanswered, echoing in the minds of Luftwaffe commanders and German civilians alike. How could such numbers even exist? The answer would emerge piece by piece, and it would change the very nature of the war. But first, it would shock the Germans into realizing they were not just fighting soldiers. They were fighting factories. The truth lay not in the skies over Germany, but thousands of miles away, hidden in the thunder of machinery and the glow of welding torches. The Germans, staring up at endless streams of bombers, could not see the real battlefield, the assembly lines of America. What they faced was not merely a surge of airplanes, but the weaponization of an entire nation's economy. The hidden advantage, the one that bewildered Luftwaffe officers and left civilians whispering in disbelief, was the transformation of the United States into the greatest production engine the world had ever seen. Factories that once built automobiles, refrigerators and farm equipment had been remade into foundries of war. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant became the most famous symbol, an assembly line designed not for cars, but for the B-24 Liberator heavy bomber. At its peak, one B-24 rolled off the line every 63 minutes. 63 minutes, from raw aluminum to a machine capable of flying 2,000 miles and dropping 5 tons of bombs. War Production Board 1943 factory report. For German intelligence, these numbers seemed like propaganda. For the men on the ground in Europe, they were a nightmare come true. Detroit, the Motor City, became the arsenal of democracy. The same engineers who had perfected the moving assembly line under Henry Ford now applied it to wings, fuselages, and machine gun turrets. General Motors converted plants to produce Pratt & Whitney engines. Packard built the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine under license, giving the P-51 Mustang its deadly range. In California, Douglas Aircraft churned out C-47 transports and SBD Dauntless dive bombers by the thousands. Boeing, up in Seattle, pushed the B-17 Flying Fortress into mass production, with nearly 13,000 built by war's end. What stunned the Germans was not just the output, but the pace. In the Reich, production was fractured. Smaller plants spread out, handcrafting aircraft in batches. Every Me-109 or FW-190 was the work of dozens of skilled laborers shaping parts with near-artisan care. The machines were excellent, but the process was slow. In America, the engineers stripped the romance from production. They turned war into a sequence of steps, each worker performing one motion, repeated thousands of times a day, the product moving relentlessly forward. It was cold, mechanical, and devastatingly effective. A dramatized report from a captured Luftwaffe officer noted his disbelief after interrogations revealed the figures. If this is true that they make thousands each month, then we are not fighting men anymore. We are fighting machines, dramatized Composite. The psychological blow was immense. For every German fighter ace with 40 or 50 kills, there were more American aircraft waiting to take flight than he could ever hope to destroy. Skill was no longer enough. The arithmetic crushed it. Behind this transformation were unsung engineers and planners. William Knudsen, former president of General Motors, had been personally recruited by President Roosevelt to oversee production. Knudsen brought with him not only expertise in mass production, but a ruthless belief that volume would win the war. Donald Nelson, chairman of the War Production Board, directed the flow of resources with near-dictatorial authority, ensuring steel, rubber, and aluminum went first to the factories building planes. Engineers like Charles Sorensen at Ford designed assembly lines that could produce aircraft faster than some nations could design them. These men were not soldiers, but their decisions killed more enemy machines than many divisions in the field. The Germans, relying on intelligence, could not comprehend how women now filled America's factories. Rosie the Riveter was more than a slogan. She was reality. Hundreds of thousands of women drilled rivets into bomber wings, welded fuselages, and tested instruments. They worked double shifts, often alongside men too old for combat but too determined to stay idle. Factories ran under floodlights 24 hours a day, 3 shifts 7 days a week. Where the Reich saw scarcity, America created abundance. Numbers became the Allies' greatest weapon. The War Production Board reported that by late 1943, American factories were delivering nearly 275 aircraft a day. By year's end, the total production for the year had reached 85,198 planes. U.S. War Production Board Annual Report 1943. For comparison, German factories managed just over 25,000 that same year. The scale difference was not simply 3-to-1. It was a tidal wave compared to a stream. Enemy frustration mounted. Luftwaffe intercept reports from late 1943 revealed despairing comments. They lose squadrons in the morning and attack again in the afternoon. It is madness. Bundesarchiv, Luftwaffe Pilot Report, November 1943. Pilots began to joke bitterly about the futility. Shoot one down and 10 appear. Laughter turned hollow, for they knew it was no exaggeration. The hidden advantage was not just in the machines, but in the logistics that supported them. American freighters, Liberty ships built in weeks rather than months, carried crated aircraft across the Atlantic. Once in Britain, they were assembled in hangars and flown into service almost immediately. German submarines prowled the seas, but the flow never stopped. For every ship sunk, more were launched. The Americans had solved not only the problem of making planes, but of delivering them. Even the British, fighting for survival, watched in awe. Winston Churchill later wrote in his memoirs, "Never in history has a nation moved with such swiftness from peace to war, from consumer goods to war machines." The speed of their transformation was as fearsome as the machines themselves. Churchill, The Second World War, Volume 5. The revelation struck the German High Command like a thunderbolt. Hitler, upon being briefed about the figures, refused to believe them. Goering dismissed them as lies, insisting that quality German engineering would always outmatch American quantity. But in the field, commanders knew the truth. They saw it every time the sky filled with bombers, every time squadrons reappeared within days of being decimated. The denial at the top only deepened the despair at the bottom. By late 1943, the Wehrmacht understood it was not just fighting armies. It was fighting the factories of Willow Run, the assembly lines of Boeing, the foundries of General Motors, the tire plants of Firestone, and the forges of Bethlehem Steel. Each rivet, each engine, each wing panel carried with it the weight of an entire nation's determination. The Germans could not believe it, because to believe it was to accept defeat. And yet the bombers kept coming, as one Luftwaffe general muttered, staring at yet another endless stream of formations. "This is not war. This is production, dramatized composite." But what exactly were these machines? What gave the American arsenal its technical edge, beyond the mere numbers? That revelation would come in the next wave, when the specifics of engineering, the weight of steel, the horsepower of engines, the thickness of armor, would show why American planes did not just exist in numbers, but dominated in performance. The Germans had felt the shock of the endless tide. Now they would face the reality of what each individual machine could do: steel, rivets, horsepower. By 1944, the American war machine was not only vast in numbers, but frightening in technical detail. Every aircraft rolling off the line was a marvel of engineering, a product of design choices that blended power, endurance, and firepower into machines that could dominate the skies. The Germans, for all their brilliance in aviation design, could not match the sheer breadth of what was now thundering into their airspace. To understand the scale of this hidden advantage, one must step onto the factory floor and into the technical heart of the arsenal of democracy. Take the B-17 Flying Fortress, the backbone of the daylight bombing campaign. Its specifications were a declaration of intent. Each B-17 weighed nearly 55,000 pounds at full load, carried up to 8,000 pounds of bombs, and bristled with 1350 caliber M2 Browning machine guns in nose, tail, dorsal, and waist positions. With a range of 2,000 miles and a service ceiling above 35,000 feet, it could strike deep into the Reich and return home even after absorbing punishing damage. Crews called it a fortress for good reason. Stories spread of bombers limping back to England with engines shredded, tails nearly gone, fuselages torn open, yet still flying. Technical Manual TM 9294, 1943, the B-24 Liberator was even more prolific. Its high aspect ratio Davis wing gave it longer range, up to 2,150 miles, and a maximum bomb load of 8,800 pounds. At 290 mph, it flew faster than the B-17, and it could be built in staggering numbers thanks to Ford's Willow Run assembly line. At one point, 650,000 parts came together with clockwork precision every single day. By war's end, over 18,000 Liberators had been built, the most of any heavy bomber in history. War Department Production Report 1944. The Germans had their Ju-88s and He-111s, but they could not compare in scale or survivability. German bombers lacked the defensive armament, and often the range to contest Allied control of the skies. The Luftwaffe's emphasis remained on fighters like the Bf-109 and Fw-190, superb machines in their own right, but increasingly trapped in defensive roles. Against formations of hundreds of fortresses and Liberators, each with overlapping arcs of machine gun fire, German fighters were torn from the sky in shocking numbers. Yet it was not only bombers that carried the technical advantage. The fighters escorting them revealed just how far American engineering had leapt. The P-47 Thunderbolt, nicknamed the Jug, was one of the heaviest fighters of the war. At 10,000 pounds empty weight, powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, producing 2,000 horsepower, the P-47 could dive at over 500 mm. Its 850 caliber guns spat death at a rate of 13 rounds per second, shredding Luftwaffe interceptors. With drop tanks, it could escort bombers deep into Germany, smashing through the fragile shell of Reich defense. And then came the P-51 Mustang. Initially underpowered, it was transformed when fitted with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, built under license by Packard in Detroit. The Mustang combined speed 440 mph with range exceeding 1,600 miles, allowing it to accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back. German pilots found themselves stalked by Mustangs even over their home bases. Adolf Galland admitted after the war, "The introduction of the P-51 was a decisive factor in our losing the air war. It made our defense of the Reich impossible." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. Factories matched the pace of the battlefield. Boeing's Seattle plant alone produced 16 B-17s every day. At North American Aviation in Inglewood, Mustangs rolled out in assembly line rhythm. In a single year, 1944, American factories delivered 96,000 aircraft. Each was stamped, tested, and flown with machine-like efficiency. War Production Board Aircraft Division Report 1944. Every bolt was part of a larger system. Aluminum flowed from Pittsburgh, steel from Bethlehem, engines from Pratt & Whitney, turrets from Sperry Gyroscope, radios from RCA. The logistical web was as much a weapon as the planes themselves. Engineers designed not just aircraft, but production pipelines, interchangeable parts, standardized fittings, modular subassemblies. A fuselage made in Kansas could be mated with wings from California and engines from Connecticut, and the aircraft would fly flawlessly. The Germans, by contrast, were trapped in artisanal bottlenecks. The Me-262 jet fighter was a marvel, capable of speeds over 500 mph and armed with 30mm cannons. But it required scarce materials, complex engines prone to failure, and political interference that delayed its mass deployment. At its peak, Germany produced only a few hundred per month, far too few to stem the American tide. Technical brilliance collapsed under the weight of strategic mismanagement and production scarcity. The difference was not just material but psychological. U.S. engineers boasted in manuals of the survivability of their machines. Test reports recorded bombers flying home with engines gone, fuel tanks riddled, control cables severed, yet still operational. Technical Manual TM 1410, 1943. This resilience demoralized Luftwaffe pilots who risked everything to down a single bomber, only to watch another 100 appear the next week. Behind the statistics stood the workers. In Detroit, women with scarves tied around their heads operated drills with factory precision. In Wichita, teenagers fresh out of high school riveted skins onto B-29 superfortresses. At Douglas, veterans unfit for combat assembled wings under floodlights. The U.S. workforce became an invisible army, one that fought not with rifles but with torque wrenches and welding arcs. German engineers understood the peril but could do little. In late 1943, Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments, warned Hitler that American factories were producing aircraft at a rate 10 times greater than Germany's capacity. Hitler dismissed the figures as exaggerated, but Speer's private notes captured the despair. "We cannot equal them. They will simply bury us in machines." Bundesarchiv, Speer Diaries, 1943. The tide of machines grew heavier with each passing month. By mid-1944, American bombers were dropping over 200,000 tons of bombs on Germany each month. Luftwaffe defenses collapsed under the weight of both firepower and psychology. German pilots, who once exuded invincibility, now described themselves as flies swarming against a hurricane. Bundesarchiv, Luftwaffe Pilot Report, 1944. This technical deep dive reveals a truth sharper than any blade. America's victory in the air was forged not just in courage or strategy, but in steel gauges, horsepower, and conveyor belts. The Luftwaffe had entered the war with speed and brilliance. But by 1944, they were staring into the eyes of an enemy whose strength was measured in production capacity, torque ratings, and the daily rhythm of assembly lines. The Germans had fought the aircraft. Now they began to realize they were fighting the engineers behind them, but it was not enough to build the machines. The true test came when these aircraft clashed in the skies above Europe, where every statistic became flesh, fire, and loss. The moment of reckoning would arrive in battles that tested not only the metal but the men who flew it. March 6, 1944. The target was Berlin. At dawn, the crews of the 8th Air Force strapped into their cockpits across the misty fields of eastern England. Frost clung to wings as mechanics moved among the bombers, checking fuel lines, ammunition belts, and hydraulics one last time. The roar began like distant thunder, swelling into an unbroken symphony as engines ignited row by row. More than 800 B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators surged into the sky that morning, accompanied by nearly 1,000 escort fighters. It was the largest single daylight raid of the war thus far. Their orders were clear: break the spine of the Reich by striking its very heart. For German civilians in Berlin, the sirens began before noon. Air raid wardens shouted into megaphones as crowds scrambled for the shelters. The city that had once been the center of Hitler's empire braced for annihilation. Above the streets, German flak batteries filled the sky with black puffs of bursting shells. The Luftwaffe scrambled 700 fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s, Focke-Wulf 190s, and a few Me-410 heavy fighters into the air. They knew the odds, but they had no choice. The clash unfolded like a storm front colliding with a mountain range. German interceptors slashed into the bomber streams, cannons spitting fire. Dozens of B-17s went down in flames, their crews bailing out into the cold March sky. Yet for every bomber that spiraled downward trailing smoke, another 5 pressed forward, locked in tight formation. Waist gunners squeezed their triggers until barrels smoked, tracers streaking across the heavens. One Luftwaffe pilot later recalled, "It was like attacking a moving fortress wall. The crossfire was unbearable. We were being slaughtered before we even reached them." Bundesarchiv, Luftwaffe Pilot Debrief, March 1944. The escorts changed everything. P-51 Mustangs, sleek and silver with red or yellow noses, dove like hawks into the German formations. Powered by Packard-built Merlin engines, they cut through the Luftwaffe with speed and precision. German pilots accustomed to dictating terms found themselves hunted instead. One after another, Messerschmitts burst into fireballs under the Mustang's relentless fire. Within hours, the air over Berlin had transformed into a graveyard of burning wreckage. By the end of the day, the cost was staggering. The US lost 69 bombers and 11 fighters, nearly 700 airmen killed, captured, or missing. But the Luftwaffe's losses were catastrophic. 160 fighters destroyed, including many of its veteran pilots. Unlike the Americans, the Germans could not replace them. For the Reich, it was a defeat not measured only in machines but in irreplaceable men. U.S. Army Air Force's After-Action Report, March 6, 1944. The battle for Berlin was only one chapter in a relentless campaign. In February, Operation Argument, later called Big Week, had already struck deep into German aircraft factories. In 6 days, Allied bombers dropped over 10,000 tons of bombs on Leipzig, Augsburg, Regensburg and Schweinfurt. Though losses were heavy, the raids crippled German production. Factories that had once turned out hundreds of fighters a month now struggled to produce even a fraction. The Luftwaffe, forced to throw its reserves into the air, bled itself white against the endless American tide. The statistics tell the story. Between January and June 1944, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 12,000 aircraft. American factories replaced their losses within weeks. German factories fell months behind. Reports from Luftwaffe field commands reveal the despair. Our squadrons are shadows. For every mission, fewer return. Each time, fewer replacements arrive. Soon there will be nothing left to fly. Bundesarchiv, Luftwaffe Command Report, 1944. One decisive clash came over Leipzig on February 20, 1944. As 700 bombers streamed toward the Messerschmitt plants, German interceptors rose to meet them. The battle lasted hours. American gunners claimed hundreds of kills. The Luftwaffe claimed dozens of bombers. When the smoke cleared, the factories lay in ruins. In the weeks that followed, German output of Bf-109s fell by nearly half. Allied intelligence confirmed what the pilots already knew. Germany was running out of both planes and pilots. The psychological impact was as profound as the physical. Civilians in Leipzig and Regensburg wrote in their diaries of skies darkened by swarms of machines, endless and merciless. Bundesarchiv, Civilian Diary, 1944. German soldiers on the Eastern Front reported morale collapsing as rumors spread of entire cities flattened from the air. The Wehrmacht, once unshakable, began to ask whether the fatherland itself could survive. The Americans, for their part, recognized the turning point. General Karl Spaatz, commander of U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe, wrote after Big Week, "The Luftwaffe is broken. It is only a matter of time before our dominance is total." NARA Strategic Air Forces Report, 1944. By summer, this prediction came true. When Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, they did so under skies utterly owned by American and British aircraft. German counterattacks were shredded before they began. Their armored columns reduced to twisted wreckage by rocket-firing Thunderbolts and strafing Mustangs. The first major battle examples, Regensburg, Leipzig, Berlin, proved more than tactical victories. They demonstrated the fatal mismatch between German doctrine and American production. No matter how fiercely the Luftwaffe fought, no matter how many bombers they destroyed, the Allies always returned in greater numbers. For the German pilots, the despair was crushing. One veteran later confessed, "We were lions in the air, but lions cannot fight the ocean." And that is what America became, an ocean of machines. Dramatized composite. The Germans had been stunned in 1943 by the sight of hundreds of bombers. By 1944, they faced thousands, escorted by fighters that made survival itself a gamble. The great battles over Regensburg, Leipzig, and Berlin shattered the Luftwaffe and exposed the truth of America's hidden advantage. Yet the story did not end on the battlefield. The greater impact was still to come, in strategy, in psychology, and in the very legacy of warfare itself. The storm of steel and aluminum unleashed from American factories would echo long after the last bombs fell. The world would never view industry or war the same way again. The smoke over Berlin, Leipzig, and Regensburg eventually cleared, but what lingered was something deeper than rubble. It was the dawning realization that the war had shifted irreversibly. Germany's hopes of victory did not collapse in a single moment of defeat, but under the grinding weight of arithmetic. Factories, workers, machines. The Luftwaffe's finest aces had fought like demigods in the skies, but no amount of bravery could reverse a tide built by the roar of Detroit's assembly lines or the sleepless shifts at Boeing in Seattle. The strategic, psychological, and lasting legacy of America's industrial storm was now unmistakable. Inside the Reich, despair seeped into every corner. Civilians who once huddled in shelters with grim confidence began whispering of inevitability. Diaries recovered after the war describe a shift in tone, from faith in the Luftwaffe's shield to resignation that the skies belonged to the enemy. "Every morning," one Berlin resident wrote in July 1944, "we hear them before we see them. The sky shakes, the walls tremble, and yet we know there are always more coming. We have stopped counting." Bundesarchiv, Civilian Diary, 1944. Fear transformed into fatalism. Among soldiers, morale collapsed in stages. On the Eastern Front, Wehrmacht divisions wrote home of being strafed and bombed endlessly. Their movements paralyzed, their supply lines shredded. One field officer reported that the most terrifying sound was no longer artillery, but the distant hum that means death is already on the way. Bundesarchiv, Wehrmacht Field Report, 1944. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, had become a ghost. Squadrons gutted, fuel scarce, the skies no longer contested, but surrendered. For the Allies, the psychological effect was the opposite. Every new squadron of Mustangs that reached Britain, every wave of bombers that thundered home despite losses, reinforced a sense of inevitability. American airmen believed they were the hammer of destiny. And British civilians, who had once fought alone under the Blitz, now looked up to see swarms of American aircraft filling the sky in defense of their island. Winston Churchill himself admitted after the war, it was not merely courage that saved us, but the steel and sweat of the American worker. Churchill, The Second World War, Volume 6. Strategically, the flood of aircraft shattered the Axis war machine in ways that went beyond bombs. German industry, already strained, was forced underground, dispersed into caves and forests, desperately trying to escape the reach of Allied bombers. Rail lines were smashed, oil fields burned, synthetic fuel plants obliterated. By late 1944, Hitler's armies faced not only enemies on every front, but a logistical strangulation from the skies. Tanks sat idle for lack of gasoline. Trains never arrived, communications collapsed. And when the Battle of the Bulge came in December, American fighters scythed through German supply convoys, ensuring the last great offensive of the Reich died in the snow. The psychological collapse of the Luftwaffe was confirmed in post-war interrogations. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey of 1946 records dozens of testimonies from captured officers. One stated flatly, "By 1944, we knew the war was lost. The Americans built planes faster than we could destroy them. We had no answer." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Another confessed bitterly, "Every time I strapped into my cockpit, I knew I was flying toward death. Because even if I survived, tomorrow there would be more, and more again." The weight of inevitability crushed morale as surely as the bombs crushed factories. Beyond victory in Europe, the legacy of American air production carried forward into the post-war world. The Cold War dawned not with tanks crossing borders, but with the knowledge that industry could decide destiny. The Soviet Union studied Willow Run as carefully as they studied Normandy, recognizing that the secret weapon of the United States was not just its atomic bomb, but its industrial depth. When the Korean War erupted, when Vietnam escalated, when the Gulf War unleashed precision bombing, the template of overwhelming air power born in 1943 to 45 was evident. For veterans, the memory never faded. American crews who flew through flak-filled skies carried scars and pride in equal measure. German civilians who survived the firestorms spoke of nightmares filled with endless bombers, and engineers who had riveted wings and tightened bolts returned to civilian life, knowing that their factory hands had been as decisive as any rifle on the front. Rosie the Riveter, once a propaganda figure, became an icon of a generation that had proven production itself could be a weapon. The numbers remain almost surreal. By the war's end, the United States had produced 300,000 aircraft. Germany had produced less than half that number. Yet the true gap was not in raw totals, but in rhythm. America replaced losses instantly. Germany bled slowly, irreversibly. The Reich's skies had become a canvas painted with contrails of inevitability, and from that canvas emerged the lesson of a century. That modern war is not won merely by the courage of soldiers or the genius of commanders, but by the invisible engines of production, by the assembly lines, by the endless hum of machines turning steel into wings. The Luftwaffe had entered the war as a predator. It ended as prey to an enemy whose greatest general was not a man, but a factory. One German officer, broken and weary after surrender, summed it up with haunted clarity. "We did not lose to your soldiers. We lost to your factories." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The legacy of that revelation echoes still. In every conflict since, from the Cold War arms race to the drone swarms of the modern battlefield, the ghost of 1943 whispers the same truth. In war, Courage matters. Strategy matters. But above all, numbers matter. And when the United States turned out 8,000 planes a month, the outcome of the Second World War was already written in steel. Rivets and smoke across the skies of Europe,